We also encourage all participants to use the chat box to submit your comments, your questions, and your inputs. Selected questions will be addressed during the moderated discussion. We have interpretation services in French and Portuguese. You can select your preferred language channel at the bottom of your Zoom screen. Today we have three distinguished speakers. And then after those presentations, we'll have a moderated discussion and a Q&A session. With that, I would like to begin by introducing our first speaker, Dr. Yosser Hamdi, who is a genomist at the Pasteur Institute in Tunis. Dr. Yosser have been very instrumental in our effort to consult and develop the continental human genomics and precision public health framework and strategy. Dr. Yosser, over to you.
Thank you very much, Sophonias, and thank you to all those who joined us today for this first webinar. So I'm going to start with giving a bit of context of this webinar and also of the Africa CDC Continental Roadmap for Human Genomics and Precision Public Health. So as you may know, precision medicine is this approach for disease treatment and prevention that takes into account individual variability in genes, environment, and lifestyle. And in contrast to the one-size-fits-all approach in which disease treatment and prevention strategies are developed for the average person that is driven by symptoms, the precision medicine approach takes into consideration differences between individuals, and it leads to individualized approaches that are informed by genomics data as well as other omics and clinical data. And all this will lead to tailored treatments, more effective treatments that come with fewer side effects. So building on the foundation of precision medicine, precision public health expands the focus from individualized care to population-level strategies. And this by combining the genomics, environmental, lifestyle factors, also with innovative healthcare systems, access to drugs and therapies, and getting more diverse partners altogether for a more precise prediction and diagnosis of the diseases and for more accessible and affordable targeted therapies and personalized health and wellness plans. So far, several countries and regions in the world, they have already generated lots of data on their populations, and they launched several human genome projects, and they've been able to make use of the data that they generated to start implementing precision medicine and precision public health in their countries. And the question now is, what about Africa? And I think that we all agree that in Africa, we did a huge progress during the last decade in the field of human genomics, mainly with the H3 Africa project, but also with the involvement of several organizations, including the African Union, African CDC, EDCTP, the WHO Afro, WHO EMRO, the African Academy of Science, the African Union development agencies, and several policy briefs, frameworks, and reports have been published on the implementation of genomic medicine for public health in Africa. In parallel, several human genome projects have been launched in Africa. So in Senegal, in Nigeria, in South Africa, in Uganda, Tanzania, Egypt, and in Tunisia. And I'm pretty sure that several of our African countries are planning to launch their human genome projects soon. However, and despite all these efforts, African human genomics data are still very underrepresented in public databases. And as you can see here, in 2024, African data represent only 0.8% of the data that is available in public databases. And I know that in 25, it's around 0.3. But it's not just about data, it's also about the limited resources that we have in the continent, the lack of infrastructure, lack of human resources, the readiness level of our healthcare systems. So all those are gaps that we are aware of. And for this reason, the African CDC launched this initiative. And African CDC now is trying to ask the right question to bring the right solutions to those challenges. And the question is, how can African nations strategically harness human genomics to create their own path in implementing precision public health while ensuring equity, inclusiveness, local capacity building, and scientific sovereignty. So the main goal of this initiative is really to develop a continental roadmap through defining the resources, the required partnerships, but also by identifying the key priority areas for genomic medicine, precision public health in Africa, and also by establishing a governance and coordination mechanism for the continental agenda through identifying the roles and responsibilities of all parties. So the journey started in Addis last year with a consultative meeting where we've been able to bring brilliant minds and experts from different African countries and from different backgrounds. So we had clinicians, medical doctors, researchers, policymakers from industry, from biotech, from pharma. And we have excellent discussions, debates, talks, presentations, and roundtables. And during those 3 days, we've been able to start pinpointing the key priority areas, the key gaps, the key challenges, and also the key opportunities that we have in the continent. So after this consultative meeting, the mission team started drafting a short report that has been already shared with those who attended the consultative meeting. But also we are working on a more detailed report that is almost ready and that will be shared with the broader community. And in this report, we are putting key findings based on the discussions that we had during the consultative meeting, but also based on previous experiences and initiatives in Africa. This report will also include key recommendations and a SWOT analysis that is focusing on the strengths, the weaknesses, the opportunities, and the threats of this field in the continent. So to elaborate this continental roadmap, we really need to proceed with a very critical review of previous initiatives and their outcomes. Human genomics, workforce and training in Africa. The third webinar will be on ethical, legal, social issues in human genomics in Africa. The fourth one will be on innovative technologies, data science, and drug development in the continent. Then we will be talking about sovereignty, equity, funding, and private-public partnerships. And finally, the last webinar, and hopefully that we will be discussing the roadmap, maybe the first version of this roadmap that we really hope that we would be able to develop with all of you. So the take-home message is, what we want to say is that this is a very continental initiative. And in this initiative, we want to really make use of the African human genomics data that was generated, but that will be generated soon, in order to implement precision public health in the African continent. Also, we want to build on previous and ongoing efforts and initiatives. So we are not going to start from scratch. Inclusiveness is key. It's key because we are deeply convinced that the gaps that we are facing are huge and they cannot be filled by one person or one initiative or one country. So we really need to involve all main stakeholders in this field. Equity and scientific sovereignties are crucial. Partnership, public-private partnerships within Africa, South-South collaborations are also very important. Transparency, trust, and communication are essential to guarantee the success of this initiative. And last but not least, this is a high level essential to guarantee the success of this initiative. And last but not least, this is a high-level initiative that is led by Africa CDC, African leadership, and is developed by Africans for Africans. But when we say that it's for Africans, this means that it can be very useful to other populations worldwide. So I'd like to finish by thanking the mission team, Dr. Sophonius Tesema, Dr. Alan Chrysophos, Dr. Sarah Manji, Dr. Colette Madandar, and Dr. Mohamed Zahir. My colleagues, Colette and Mohamed, worked very hard on preparing this webinar to prepare the consultative meeting and to draft the reports. I would like to thank them a lot for their efforts. Special thank you to all the experts who participated in the consultative meeting, and thanks to all of you for attending this webinar. And just one last comment for our Francophone and Lusophone colleagues participating. So we have the interpretation, but please don't hesitate to ask your questions. Je serai là pour répondre à toutes vos questions en français si vous voulez. Merci beaucoup, and thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Yosser, for providing that context. I would also like to join you in thanking everyone who's been providing these inputs. But this is a continuous process, and the webinars, your comments, your questions, your inputs will be valuable in shaping this agenda. So please put your questions, your comments on the chat box. I will not take much time, but thank you so much again, Yosef, for your time, and for our colleagues, Dr. Mohammed Zahir, Professor Colette Dandra, Professor Alan Christoffel, and Sarah, who made this webinar happen, and all the background work that's ongoing in developing this strategy. So with that, let me invite Professor Ramsey for another insightful presentation. I think Professor Ramsey will not need any introduction. So I'll just pass the floor to Professor Michelle. Over to you, Professor.
Thank you very much, Sophonius, and I'm really delighted to be part of this inaugural seminar for the Africa CDC and thinking about how we move forward in terms of a continental effort. And thank you, Yosef, for that beautiful introduction. I think we need to acknowledge that there's so much that is already happening on the African continent, and that it is really about building and extending this. So my task this morning is to talk a little bit about some of the initiatives that we have ongoing, but then also to think about how we move forward in terms of ensuring that precision medicine and precision public health can actually become part of the ecosystem and infrastructure of our health systems in Africa. So Yosser has beautifully described precision medicine, and we really want to understand the underlying biology to take us all the way through to better health outcomes for our populations. And, we often think about precision medicine as being most important and relevant in the first instance in terms of rare or Mendelian disorders, taking us to targeted treatment, including thinking about pharmacogenomics and how genetic variation can impact our response to drugs. Cancer genomics is a very hot field at the moment, and we want to make sure that that too is accessible and appropriate for African populations. And eventually, we hope that this will also impact on complex diseases that often manifest later in life, but are increasing in Africa and as a sort of burden that needs to be addressed for better health. So I think we're all aware of the fact that a lot of initiatives have been happening over the past decades, but the African Society of Human Genetics has been instrumental in building a network across the continent. And as we have had our annual meetings, we have added countries on the continent that now have societies of human genetics. And I think this is an important area for us to continue to expand and to bring other countries on board. And already there are nascent national genomic projects in several African countries, and I've just listed some of them here, but I think others are also starting to think about it. And this is important because we do need to understand the genetic background of our populations if we are going to be implementing genomic medicine. So one of the projects that has been very important on the continent is the Human Heredity and Health in Africa, or H3 Africa, which started more than a decade ago. And its aim was really to ensure that we have more capacity for human genomics on the continent, and that we also strengthen our South-South collaborations. Right. But we need to think about the fact that, Africa is a very diverse continent. Our people are very diverse because this is the origins of our species. And not only is the genetics different, but also the climate, the environment in other ways, the diet and so on. And all of that impacts on how we think about precision medicine. So this is one of the key projects that was done by H3 Africa. And the principal component analysis here, based on hundreds and thousands of genetic variants, just
recording in progress.
Discrete units, and that needs to be considered. I wanted to just briefly tell you about another project which is helping us also understand very understudied populations in Africa. People often ask, how many people do you have to study in Africa, and how many countries do you have to cover to get a full understanding of what is happening on the African continent in terms of genetic diversity? And that is a very difficult question to answer. But you can see the countries involved here in giving us, 1,000 high coverage whole human genomes, and also giving us insights into just how complicated and complex these studies are when we're trying to coordinate across many national borders. We have now also an initiative called the African Population Cohorts Consortium, which I think we can leverage in terms of going forward. And this blueprint sketches the vision. And we're very happy to say that this is now being supported through funding from the Wellcome, and will also help us build more capacity, but also larger cohorts in Africa. This initiative, which was a partnership between Europe and Africa in terms of personalized medicine, has also come up with an action plan and has sketched out what is currently the state in different countries in terms of capacity for genomic research, but also highlights very importantly that there is a lot less capacity for implementation in a clinical context. So this is the slide that I want to focus on more, and to say, when we think about Africa and we think about genomic medicine, precision medicine, we know that there are extraordinary pockets of excellence, and those cover a whole range of different areas where research is being done. But importantly, we have a set of networks, and these are our learned societies, whether they're societies of human genetics or infectious diseases, biochemistry, laboratory medicine. They've been really important. And then leveraging our H3 Africa Bionet network, but also the fact that we now have networks for rare diseases, for pharmacogenomics, and very happy to see the launch of the Africa CDC genomics component, sort of really pushing and galvanizing a way forward. We're very excited that we now also have the first steps and the first funding for an African Bioinformatics Institute, which I think will be very important in terms of data sharing, and also management of data, and making data accessible to people who need to use it. And I think Christian Happy is going to talk a little bit about the African Genomics Centers of Excellence and how those fit into the ecosystem that we're trying to build across Africa. We have lots of champions and partnerships, and those are at all different levels, as you can see here. And finally, what is it that really supports genomic and precision medicine in Africa? And it is about publicizing our success stories, making sure that we use those also for advocacy and activism. But we need to really think about, economic assessments, what will be affordable and accessible in an African context. And most of all, we need to garner political will to get national governments to really invest in precision medicine and think about how they allocate resources. And in that context, we also need to think about ethical and legal frameworks. So it's very good that there will be a whole session on that later. We need to think about existing and future laboratory and clinical services, and also biobanking for research purposes. But probably most importantly, we need to focus on that skilled workforce and how we're going to manage our data. In Africa, we don't work in isolation. Although this is an African-led project, we need to align with international best practices. And, the very first project of the WHO Science Council was to come up with this program and this document, which is about accelerating access to genomics for global health, and the fact that nobody should be left behind. There is a broader context that we need to consider, and I know the slide is overwhelming, and many of you will recognize many of these organizations, but they have been key in terms of setting standards that all of us need to follow. And Africa is part of the world, so we need to be part of all these international organizations. So what do we think about moving ahead in the next steps? Under the WHO, there's also now this a technical advisory group for genomics that have come up with a set of principles in terms of genome data collection, access, use, and sharing. And I'm not going to go through the schematic on the right, but I think that is also an excellent roadmap for us to think about when we think about Africa. What are our challenges? How can we address those through strategic actions? And what are the outcomes that we would like to see? So in the African context, I think there's so much that we need to be mindful of. First of all, we need to understand local context, and that is local context in many different regions and in all the countries of Africa. We need to think very carefully about how we define disease cut points. And that is important as we think about it, because it's not necessarily the same in different contexts. We need to think about regional differences and very importantly, gene-environment interactions, because there's a lot of research now showing that diaspora populations, first generation, in other settings respond differently and have different genetic associations with specific diseases. We need to think carefully about cost-effective data generation and also capacity for data generation on the continent. And very importantly, this concept of transferability. If we do develop assays and tests in the rest of the world, how do they transfer in Africa? If we develop them in one part of Africa, how applicable or transferable are they going to be to other parts of Africa? And I think what we're all hoping for is that there will be an impact on the health of the people of the continent. And that means that we have to think about clinical implementation. And with that, I'm going to stop sharing my screen and hand this back to Sophonius. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Prof. Ramsey, for that insightful presentation on the ongoing initiatives and the required partnerships and the things that we all need to be mindful about as we continue to consult and develop this continental roadmap. We are very grateful to have you, and thank you so much for such an insightful presentation. Without further ado, we have one more presentation. Professor Christian Happy is with us, who also needs no introduction as a global leader in genomics. Professor Happy has been working with us very closely in the pathogen genomics space. And today we are here discussing about human genomics. So now I'll invite Professor Happy, and we are very, very honored to have you with us on this webinar. Over to you, Professor Happy.
Yeah, I want to believe that you all see my screen. So if you see my screen, so today I would probably just going to say share a bit how we harness the power of genomics to transfer healthcare in Africa, but then learning from Sophonia's mentioned, from pathogen genomics. And then I'll close in by probably just sharing this initiative that Michelle alluded to. And then that is the Genomic Centers of Excellence in Africa. I really want to thank Yosri and then Michelle for the very great introduction and then also setting the scene for this presentation. So as you understand that genomics has really changed the way, we approach healthcare. And of course, we will recognize the fact that these technological innovations are almost eluding us, but then we're trying to, advance the agenda on the African continent, working with Africa CDC right from the beginning. So one thing that we did was at the beginning is really how to see what is the low-hanging fruit. We started doing this in the space of infectious disease. Basically here you could see how, here we set up a platform called the Center of Excellence for Africa Center of Excellence for Genomics of Infectious Disease. But then one of the very first things that we did was actually to see this to, characterize febrile illness, to respond to outbreaks. Our very first outbreak that we responded to was, Ebola. We actually transformed the way outbreak response is done, near real-time genomic sequencing, discovery of variants of concern, translational genomics in the sense that we basically just went from genome sequence data to create the very first set of rapid diagnostics, real-time genomic sequencing, discovery of variants of concern, translational genomics in the sense that we basically just went from genome sequence data to create the very first set of rapid diagnostics that I mentioned before. our knowledge of that to start really understanding host pathogen interaction. And this is a case where we published in Nature Microbiology last year, where we were able to use, genome-wide association studies along with to understand exactly how the virus and then the human genome interact. We're able to identify, for instance, a mutation in some people that get infected with the virus but do not come down with the disease. And then that mutation located at large, here in chromosome 22. And then we're able to explain the mechanism, knowing that mutation, the presence of that mutation, interact a large protein with alpha-dystroglycan response. When it is mutated, actually block the entrance of the virus into the cell. So that basically saying that when you want to study human human genomics in Africa, we need to study that in the context of all our problems, which is infectious diseases, and then that will be very helpful. So leveraging that, we also understand that you could use it for discovering pathogens. But also, most importantly, is the fact that also helps us and position this continent in a very unique way to respond to SARS-CoV-2, the COVID-19 pandemic. Our lab was the very first in Africa to sequence the first SARS-CoV-2. We would leverage that, share the information across the continent, and then we could see our beautiful continent, also work with Africa CDC to build capacity on the continent. But then we could see the continent going forward, for instance, to create and massive to respond and then and create data that help the world to respond to the COVID. You saw South Africa, colleagues in South Africa discovering the beta variant and then the one in Botswana, the Omicron. So that's very helpful. But then this really prepared us better actually to veer into the field of human genomics. And in this case, for instance, you could notice that during COVID, we didn't have a lot of mortality in Africa. And then the Nobel Prize of 2021, actually, which is Pablo, actually, from sequencing ancient viruses, actually found a good correlation between, Neanderthal DNA and then some, protection to COVID-19. And this basically just shows us that within the continent of Africa, we do have a lot that we can actually still uncover and then share to the world. But then why is it important? I think there are many important reasons to invest in the African genome, especially because of variation. We know that very little, very few, population move out of Africa to the rest of the world. So which means in real sense, a lot of the diversity that is expected actually to drive health innovations actually remain within the African continent. And then as such, ancestry becomes very important. Michelle mentioned the fact that, the environment plays a very important role. So I think the ecology, studying that in the context of ecology is very important. But one of the major reasons actually to study African genetic variation is actually to bring down the whole idea of equity. We understand pretty well, as Yosri mentioned before, so we really do not, this is a 2022 slide, but I think Yosri mentioned the fact that now we have 0.3% of African genomes in the global database. But then this really important study that done by Segun Fatima, shout out to him here, to show clearly how we're underrepresented we are. But then most importantly is the fact that, we could basically, the H3 Africa, for instance, data set, studying very few genomes could show the value of studying African genomes. Just studying sequencing few African genomes, at least, that data set actually showed how much you could uncover. So about 3.4 million SNPs and novel variation found in African genomes, that's for studying very few genomes from Africa. And that actually shows the potential, of studying African genomes. But then some variants, in African genomes have been shown to be very, very important and very useful. So, and then you could see here, this is a case of PCSK9, which is a frequent nonsense mutation to see, people with low density lipoproteins, but actually showing, a strong association in this case, for instance, with people with those metabolic diseases. And this basically actually, shows that this particular variant found in African population, is now being used as a target, for instance, for dyslipidemia therapeutic. Z1B3, for instance, is another, variant that you'll find in association in African populations associated with type 2 diabetes mellitus, with beta cell and also associated with insulin response. And this basically, again, showing clearly how African, genetic variation can actually help, address some major, health problems, in the context of the world. Then APOL1, as you know, driven by trypanosomiasis infection or trypanosomes, actually also has very great correlation with kidney disease. And then that really have also a lot of promises in how you can use, some of these mutations to address some of these health challenges. And then if we didn't study African genome, we'll be able to make these major discoveries. Then also, as Michelle mentioned, geography and then also environmental factors are very important. So I think some studies, here, for instance, this is a study published in South in 2023, show public selection, due to local adaptation of African populations. So which means that effectively, if you want to study African genomics, we need to study as many populations as possible because those variations are actually driven by many other factors. So which means we need to be very continentally driven. And some of these genetic variations have been seen in other, in other populations could be very homogeneous, but in the context of Africa, we need to do a lot, and in order to use some of these variations to actually establish things like polygenic risk scores for different diseases. And this is a work from Segun, for instance, to show that, clearly it's going to be very difficult in the context of Africa to just use a set of variation to establish those. Then we need to dig into in the context of Africa because of our diversity across the continent. So I want to close in by just bringing these new initiatives, right? So this is where we stood. I think there are a lot of initiatives on the continent, but then we established this initiative following COVID, and then where we learned some major lessons. Some of those major lessons was the fact that despite the fact that we could do genomics extremely well in Africa, but then we remain very vulnerable. Vulnerability due to the fact that, we could not translate genomic data into solutions. Solutions here means diagnostics, drugs, and therapeutics, and then that made us very vulnerable. Even when Africa together have assembled more than $2 billion who have access to vaccines, we couldn't have access to them simply because we're very dependent on the outside, and then the world was closed. The world closed down on us, and unfortunately, we couldn't access. And that really, we actually brought us to just create these initiatives as far back as 2021. So where we started thinking about how we want to set up a translational genomic platform on the continent that will be African-led, owned, and then and driven by science and innovation in Africa. But then that will basically be addressing issues related, will help us to deploy novel technology, build skills and infrastructure on the continent to build the capacity of the continent to address its own health challenges. And this basically, in our initial phase, we have to engage the Africa CDC. I remember being at the Africa CDC on a meeting with the leadership of PGI. But then the goal here basically to work with Africa CDC and then leverage what we have here, for pathogen genomic surveillance to the PGI, but actually to translate the genomic data, for instance, into diagnostics and therapeutics. So basically, here is not to redo what the PGI is doing, but actually bringing together Africa academic research and then government institutions and the private sector in order to actually just translate, again, genomic data or genomic sequences into diagnostics, therapeutics, and others. Then use genomics to inform public health, on the continent and then also in the African diaspora, but also use academic training centers, for instance, to build, the next generation of genomic researchers. You agree with me that, yes, right now there are just a few of the vaccine production centers or platforms in Africa, but then we need a workforce to build, and then to man those places. And I think, if we were basically just going to be utilizing genomic translation across the continent, there's a need to harmonize existing project, coordinate with a network that is already existing in the African continent, and then help create, an equitable coordinated genomic framework. But then the goal here was basically the dream and the vision is actually to establish 10 centers of excellence across the continent. We want to be very mindful of the fact that we want this to be geographical spread, not in one single part of Africa. We want all part of Africa to have centers of excellence, and each center of excellence will have a mandate to mentor, 2 developing centers. So very much is a hub and spoke model. But then we really want to not just to do sequencing, but we really want to, be focused on the translation of the genomic sequence data to improve health outcomes on the continent. In bringing this is a one unique value proposition. I think one here is access. How do we use this as a way to enable access to medicine? And how do we also create equity in the sense that we want to make sure that, the tools and the countermeasures developed, can actually bring just to the level where we can actually do it science in a way that is very important. And then I think we're also leveraging this actually to create global impact. You could see 4 pillars here. So our emphasis is on translational medicine, engaging government, and our emphasis is on translational medicine, engaging government and industry. So which is often not done at, the tools are in nature. So basically just finding solution than to describing problem in nature. So basically just finding solution than to describing problems. So in the long term, we believe that, through GENCO and then through collaboration with other initiatives on the continent together, we can actually ensure long-term workforce development, local manufacturers of drugs and vaccines and then therapeutics, prevention of kidney disease through APOL1 as mentioned, then finding a cure for HIV, delivering sickle cell. We understand that sickle cell treatment is available now through CRISPR technology, but then the cost is about $2 million. We believe that through this, we can actually bring down the cost to about $2,000 a test. And understanding the risk of genetic or other cardiovascular diseases, using polygenic risk score for diagnosis, for instance, and then establishing long-term clinical trial networks, on the continent, but most importantly, things like precision oncology for African populations. As I mentioned before, we have ABI with whom we can actually work together. So this is basically just give you an idea of how we've gone. So in order to have access to resources, we've actually registered in the US and then also registered in Rwanda, for instance. So just to give you some progress, we and then this give you a bit of information about this. We had one time we had one town hall where we actually presented this idea. But then I just want to say here that we've been able to, for the coordinating center, we've been able to secure some resources. There's an independent, I would say, initiative by the farmers in Africa called the Partnership for Accelerating Genomic Research in Africa. We basically just leverage that initiative and then see how we can bring that together, and then also leveraging GENCO, for instance, as a way to help, do things in a way that is right to avoid exploitation, and then the data going out of Africa without having the context of Africans, having African DNA taken away and without us benefiting. I just want to say, for instance, that we also, as a GENCO, have been approved by some other groups, but with the mandate of with the intention of collecting samples and then being owners of those, and they would definitely refuse to work with them. And we're trying to push this agenda. So the PAGRA, for instance, they have a mindset to set up about 50,000 genome. This is a program by some farmers, but we're basically just making sure that we work with them to ensure that wherever they're working, they can share the data, that the Africans can have, access to the data, create an embargo, use the data effectively, and then in order to move science in Africa in a novel way. So basically just so these are some of the things that we've done, basically just trying to ensure that we can leverage the opportunities in order to actually ensure that, science is done in Africa, and then all of this work done on the continent, but also ensuring that the scientists on the African continents are protected. So this gives you the way we kind of set things up with them. So, and then this is a private, this initiative, we're hoping that through this, we can start empowering Africans actually that are working with members of the PAGRA consortium to do work in a way that it will be very helpful and then devoid of what I call data flying out of Africa. So this gives you a sense of what we've done so far. We have some, we had the UN some months ago. We actually engaged, we engage communities in Africa. So, but then this just gives you a sense of how we want to move forward. We're trying to get the resources and put the resources together, but we're hoping that once we have enough resources together, apart from the coordinating center that we have now, we should be able to make some calls and then try to see whether we can make competitive calls in order to allow what we say qualified centers, for instance, to start, building on the resources available to build the capacity. So give you an idea of the leadership of the program that we have here, and then we also have people advising us as we're doing it. And then I just want to end up by acknowledging also those that are really driving us, in doing this. On this note, I want to say thank you, and then probably stop it here. Over.
Thank you so much, Professor Happy, for again another insightful presentation and sharing how genomics is transforming our approach for outbreak detection and response in the continent, and also the need to move towards translational genomics. where the biggest gap is in Africa. Thank you very much again. A reminder for all our audiences, you can put your comments, your question on the chat box. There's a Q&A box. If you can click there and add your comments, your questions, we'll look into that in the next section, which is where we are doing some moderated discussion. We have 15 minutes or so. We'll be focusing on some of the key burning questions that we have from our end, also from the audiences. I think the first question that I want to ask for Professor Ramsey is, we have quite a lot of projects and initiatives on the human genomics space, but how can we, Africa as a continent can come and have a robust and sustainable funding mechanism to sustain the efforts and further expand them into other countries that have no access to such type of genomics research? And the other area is what is needed in terms of developing an enabling policy framework to integrate genomics into national health sectors. If you can comment on that, Professor Ramsey, and Prof. Happy, if you follow from that.
Thank you very much, Sophonius. And, of course, that is a very complex set of questions and extremely challenging, because I think in the past in Africa, we've relied so heavily on international grant funding. And somehow for sustainability, we need to bring that back to the continent and also start thinking about how African countries and governments can start supporting funding implementation of the science that we do. So I think, there are lots of excellent things that have been done, like H3 Africa has laid the groundwork to develop responsible processes and guidelines that many of us are using and leveraging, going forward in terms of the work and the research that we do. It hasn't focused as much on implementation, so that's really important. I think, being part of the WHO Technical Advisory Group on Genomics has also been important because that has focused on understanding what the principles should be, and those should be universal across Africa, so we need to embrace those. But I think moving forward, we need to think about initiatives at national level, but also regional and continental. And we need to think about how we can start diversifying the funding and thinking about where responsibility lies. I think there's a lot of overlap in the initiatives that we've already heard about this morning, and we need to be very mindful that we integrate and understand what the roles are of the different organizations. How does Africa CDC play a role? How does that integrate with GENCO? How do we leverage all these national human genome projects? And how do we use the African Bioinformatics Institute in terms of helping us put things together? So I think we really, as scientists, we need to lobby and to inspire governments to think about integrating genomic medicine into their national health systems, because nothing works in isolation. So we have to understand the ecosystem and we have to fit in with that. But we have to work very hard from our side to make sure that we use examples that will really make a point of what the value add is. And I think we have such an extraordinary opportunity in Africa because of this tremendous diversity, and that the impact of our work can really be felt globally. So I think a lot of work ahead at many different levels, but we as a community really need to think about how we work together.
Thank you very much, Prof. Ramsey. I think I will quote it again: nothing works in isolation. This effort by Africa CDC is to connect the dots and bringing everyone together. Thank you so much for that. Prof. Happy, anything that you would like to add on this question?
Yeah, I just don't think that, I'm happy the Africa CDC is now, has set up this whole platform for human genomics, because I think before Africa CDC was being seen as an institution that is actually just focusing on infectious diseases. And then I think this is a great thing. Then to understand that the health of Africa is not just infectious disease, but it's also, you have a mandate to look at both, infectious and non-communicable disease. But then you have a very powerful convening role as Africa CDC, for instance, to make, our government see the value of genomics into into public health generally, and then into precision medicine to be very specific. I think, the work that Africa CDC did during the COVID-19 is actually clear evidence that, if you imbibe genomics into your approach to solve health problems, you could actually make a huge impact. And as such, the countries have on their own should integrate, genomics into their health system. Some countries are making progress in that direction. I said the case of Nigeria, for instance, we've established now, a genomic, national genomics surveillance framework that has both, infectious diseases and non-communicable together. We are not all the same, but we need to create a framework that help us to support those that do not have, and then those that are ahead to come together in order to create a field that is a level playing field. To add, Michelle mentioned the GENCO, for instance. When we were creating the GENCO, we actually very intentionally said that the coordinating center of the GENCO would be within the Africa CDC. Clearly, leveraging the mandate that the Africa CDC do have, for instance, in order to work together and create a system where, the output, will be actually transformational and impactful. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Professor Happy. I'll ask one more question and then we'll go to the audience's question. My next question is from the previous initiatives, such as the H3 Africa. And Prof Happy, you've been really pushing regional efforts on the pathogen space. In both cases, I think data sharing is very critical. So what are the lessons that we can learn in developing this Pan-African genomic data sharing networks? How, as we continue to generate data, the data sharing aspect has to be also looked at. So what are the lessons and what are the things that we need to look at? We will go to Professor Happy first and then Professor Ramsey will add.
Yeah, we need to be very mindful of the fact that the genome data from Africa are very important and very critical. So, and as such, the data should be owned by African. The data should be, owned by African. Even in partnership, we need to know that we need to have control of the data. So that is very important, because if we go the way, if we basically generate the data, at the end of the day, somebody else is owning those data, is really unhelpful. We need to learn from COVID-19. But for me, most importantly, I think Africa is at a critical juncture. I think enough of sequencing data, enough of saying that we're reporting variant. And then the question is that we see all this variant, we're describing all of this, and so what? The variants do not bring the drugs. The variants are not bringing the diagnosis. The variants are not bringing the therapies. I think we need to look beyond just descriptive epidemiology and then describing the variant. As a people, we need to really invest in translating the genomic data into solutions. And those solutions should be actually work within the continent in a very collaborative way, in a way that we share data, but let's work with the private sectors in Africa, or even people that want to partner, but in a very responsible way, in a way that Africa actually retain the ownership of the data and also the IPs that come out of it, in a way that it can have impact on our populations. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Professor Happy. Over to you, Prof. Ramsey.
Thank you so much. I really would like to talk a little bit about, the successes that we've had in the pathogen genomics, but about the fact that the human genome is so much larger, orders of magnitude larger, and so much more complex to analyze, as well as what the variation means in terms of health. And the world is struggling with this. We said when the Human Genome Project was finished in, the 90s, how do we understand how genetic variation influences the phenotype? And I think we're still grappling with this. And so we need to understand that we're now looking at much larger data sets. Moving them around is a problem. We need to think about building those trusted research environments within the continent. So we do need to think about, how we get people in Africa to actually commit to sharing data in a responsible way, and that we have very strong governance mechanisms to use the data responsibly. But I wouldn't say to protect the data for Africa, because, in a way we would like to see Africa have data that is available for the world in terms of, bettering health. The African diaspora is vast, and people with African heritage are all over the world. So we cannot keep that for us. So what we want to do and what we want to think about is how do we leverage, sort of our knowledge, our context of Africa to actually translate that information into something that's impactful. And, as I said before, also really understanding the ecosystem in which we're working to make sure that there's benefit in Africa. And Christian, I think it's so difficult to think about intellectual property and how we protect and leverage that so that we can have more benefit for Africa. And I think, we need to make sure that we understand how we can negotiate with industry when we work with them to ensure that benefit comes back to the peoples of Africa and that we will have access to, whether it's vaccines, medications, devices, and so on. So I think that that's really important, that we educate ourselves to make us more equal partners in these endeavors. Thank you.
Absolutely true.
Yeah, that's really very insightful. I wish if we have time to continue to discuss this further, but I would like both of you, since an advocate for regional collaboration, international collaboration, you've been establishing so many different programs. I would like you to comment on two things as we conclude this session. The first one is the importance of the South-South collaboration. Prof. Ramsey, you mentioned the diaspora, which is also very critical in this partnership. And then also, most importantly, the African biotech and pharmaceutical and the private sector, its role in strengthening human genomics in the continent. And then also, if you can conclude with what is the role of these regional organizations? And Prof, you are part of the WHO advisory group. What's the role of those kind of regional and international health organizations, public health organizations, in shaping and catalyzing human genomics and precision health in the continent? If you can conclude with these remarks, I would appreciate it. Over to you, Prof. Ramsey first, and then we'll go to Prof. Abi.
Thank you so much. I think we've covered so much already. And, for me, the most important catalyst is going to be capacity development on the continent to make sure that at many different levels, we are able to do more research here and are able to translate that in a local context. So I think, the capacity development is, again, we have to start with basic education. Then we have to have dedicated degrees and diplomas in the field of precision medicine or human genomics. And then we have to ensure that there's a regulatory aspect to ensure that this is done responsibly. And then we have to integrate it with the health system. We have to make sure that there's laboratory infrastructure and these policies are in place so that we can then translate it to the population at large. So I think there's a lot of work ahead of us. And I think, the more capacity we develop at sort of mid-career level to also then train the next generation is really important. So I'm hoping if there are funders or industry who are listening, that they will think about supporting career paths for people who will then, start working very determinedly with governments about appropriate implementation, because I think we have to let governments see that this can be a catalyst, a leapfrogging to a better health for the population, if we are able to put all of that in place. But it's going to take a workforce to make it happen, and we have to build and strengthen that workforce on the continent. So I look forward to the future of, all these initiatives and how we can really make them work together well. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much, Professor Ramsey. Prof. Happy?
Yeah, in a few words, I think Michelle said it all. I think we need to build an ecosystem. We need to build a workforce is important. We need to engage the private sector, because the private sector need to understand that, investing in genomic health in Africa can yield benefit. The governments need to understand that, making intentional investment in this space will be beneficial to all of us. The regional organizations like Africa CDC need to have set up the framework. We need to protect this data, but I'm not saying when we say protection, it means that we need to put the regulatory framework so that there's benefit. When we're collaborating and partnering with people, we know we can't do this alone, but then we also need to understand that we need a whole ecosystem to make it happen. Academic research, private sector, government, all of us have to come together. And then we also need to have trust in one another. So I learned a lot during COVID, where samples were coming to our lab from various countries, and then they trusted, and then they got the data back, and then they used the data to do a whole lot of things. So I think that trust, if persisting, we can all work together to address these things in a very collaborative way, and in a very, in partnerships that can help shape the continent in a way that wasn't done before, both from within and then with people in the diaspora, and
It's
also
2
with
o'clock.
partners that are outside, non-African partners, actors, farmers, and countries, but then doing it in a very responsible way can actually help us to achieve this goal, not only to ensure African health security, but also global health security.
Thank you so much, Prof. I think you have concluded it very, very nicely. I'm not going to try to conclude, you don't have time, but I have 2 points. One is building a trusted ecosystem, which is came multiple times. And what Prof. Ramsey keeps saying, there is a lot of work ahead of us. I think those are the 2 key points that I took as a conclusion for this session today. We are really very grateful and honored we don't have time. Sarah Mwangi, who was coordinating this webinar series, we are very grateful for setting up such a session. Thank you so much, everyone, and wish you a very good afternoon, a very good evening, wherever you are. Thank you very much for such a productive and impactful session. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.